Welcome everybody to this research seminar. Love to see you all here, and even more lovely to see Gustav Nilsonne here. We're going to talk about pathways to an open science system, replacing academic journals. A radical proposal. I added that. You didn't have that in the title. A radical proposal. So Gustav is an associate professor of neuroscience at the Karolinska Institute, and also at Stockholm University. He has many affiliations at the Department of Psychology. And you did your PhD in experimental pathology in 2009. And I guess what you're going to talk about today has a kind of removed from that, but I guess it's pathology of our publishing system will be part of your talk. So you're very active in a very interesting, for me, rather new field. I don't know how long back it goes, but you can call it meta science. This very important thing about transparency and reproducibility of medical research, but of course in other research we have problems with reproducibility too, and transparency, and a publishing system that makes the taxpayers pay a lot and not get so much access perhaps. Very welcome.
Thank you very much, Gustav. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak with you today about open science and how we can improve on scientific publishing. This kind of introduction made me feel that I want to say a few words more about my own background to try to explain how I got to where I am. So indeed, I wrote my thesis on experimental cancer research back in 2009. But then I felt that I had growing uncertainties about the reproducibility of the entire field of experimental cancer research, including my own work. And I had the opportunity to move into neuroscience. And I thought at that point that the grass was greener, that neuroscience was a field that had a better understanding of theories and how to use them, and a better discussion of reproducibility. Looking back at that, I'm not so sure that was actually the case. But in the last 10 years or so, I have increasingly been working on studies of science itself. Meta-science, as you said, Gustav. Studies of transparency and reproducibility and how we can improve the things we do. Today, I was asked to speak on this topic following some publications. We had one paper that came out fairly recently, authored by Björn Brems and myself and a number of colleagues, and which is the basis of this presentation. And in conjunction with this, I also wrote some debate pieces which were cited as the reason for inviting me today. So
that was the reason.
Thank you, Gustav. I hope we can have a broad discussion today about the role of scientific journals and scientific publishing. This paper by Brems and colleagues was written after it was proposed to us by a leading official in the European Commission that such a paper would be welcome in order to further the EU's own policy work. That's why we gathered a bunch of colleagues from different European countries, and we put together thoughts that we had been having for a long time that are not necessarily new, but that we consolidated in this piece. And we talk about 3 crises in this paper. I have been inconsistent in using the crisis narrative, I have to admit. I don't always like it, but sometimes I have done it anyway. And in this case, I'm on the record saying that we have crises. So I guess I'll stand by it, at least for the moment. So we talk about crisis of replicability, and I'll talk more about this. How it has turned out that a lot of the things that are published in scientific journals can't actually be trusted. Also, a crisis of functionality, where the scientific journals don't provide us with the tools that we need to communicate our scientific outputs when they are in different formats, and to operate on different scientific outputs by other means than reading text. And also a crisis of affordability, because the costs of scientific journal subscriptions and also open access publishing have been going up steadily for many years. Since I have been given a rather a long time to speak today. I thought I'd say a bit more about the crisis of replicability or reliability in the scientific literature. And I'll point out a few findings from my own works. Publication bias, we have a lot of it. It turns out that in many fields, the published record is dominated by articles that support the author's hypotheses. The negative findings are being lost somehow. They end up in the file drawer, or researchers analyze their data over and over again until they find something that can be presented as a positive finding. When we look at scientific articles and try to replicate them, we often find that information is missing that we would have needed to actually replicate the work. And there have also been large-scale efforts in different fields to go through bodies of literature and attempt to replicate them, but these efforts have uniformly shown that reproducibility is quite limited. And here are now a few examples where I've been involved. This is data that we have very recently generated in my group. We have followed up clinical trials in the Nordic countries that have been registered in clinical trials registries. And we have looked at those that were completed in the years 2016 to 2019. And we have checked how long it takes for any results to be published, either in the registries or in scientific journals. This last step required a lot of manual searching. So with about 2,000 trials, we found that about half had published any results of any form by 2 years. And somewhere between a quarter and 1/5 never reported any results during the entire follow-up period. Now for clinical trials there is a quite strong requirement that results should be published within 12 months. But as we can see, this is not happening. We also don't know if...
So Gustav, for us who
Yes.
are not clinical, what is the requirement about publishing in 12 months?
Without getting too much into the specifics, for drugs trials, there is a European Union directive that the results have to be published in the registry itself by 12 months. There are also other codified ethics.
Is there any pre-registration?
Yes. So in this case, we are only looking at registered clinical trials, because those are the ones that we can follow up because they are in the registries. In this case, the European Union's Clinical Trial Registry and the clinicaltrials.gov registry. We don't see here the trials that were never registered and which may not be... I mean, it could be that they are reported even less. I would say that that's fairly likely. We also have quite a lot of trials registered after the fact. And there also, I think there is a bias such that those trials that are registered post hoc are more likely to be reported. So this is a rather optimistic view. I was just about to say a moment ago that the World Health Organization has a statement on clinical trials reporting, which also strongly recommends that results be published in a registry at 12 months and in scientific journals before 24 months. In answer to your question, Gustav. Yes?
You need a microphone. Why it's not 100% at point zero? Why it's not 100%?
Yes. Thank you for pointing this out. Why is it not 100% at time zero? Indeed. So you can, of course, one can ask oneself, how long does it take to analyze the results of a clinical trial? What is the shortest time that it could take, in theory, before results could be published? And it's probably at least some weeks or months. So we would have expected, in an ideal case, these curves to start at 100%. There are two reasons for this. One is that because of the strategy that we used in matching publications, it could be that some of the publications we have found report on some interim results from the trial before the trial was completed. There are some examples of that. But I think the leading example is that researchers don't mark their trial as completed when it was completed. Instead, the trial is left as ongoing in the registry. And then when it's time to release the results, they look at the registration and realize, oh, it's still ongoing. and then market as completed at the same time as the results are being published.
So this delay has nothing to do with reviews?
Yes, and I appreciate this question. So, in about 10% of the cases, the results were published because they were uploaded in the registry itself. 90% approximately of these results were reported in scientific articles. So of course there is a lag time in the review, and we don't know exactly how long. But indeed, one of the points that I would like to make here is that scientific journal publishing is slowing down the dissemination of knowledge here. It's indeed a kind of filter on the entire research front that prevents us from seeing the most current knowledge that we otherwise could. Here is another example. My examples are quite brief. Well, feel free to ask any questions, of course, but I had intended to give rather a kind of glimpses of evidence supporting the idea that there's a limited reproducibility. Here's results from some work that we did a few years ago. We followed up articles in the journal Cognition that had shared their data, and we tried to reproduce the analyses. And we found that it was possible in a third of the cases, approximately. Then we contacted the authors of the remaining articles, and we were able to resolve another third and reach the same results with the same data. For the last third, it was not possible, even when the authors replied to us and explained what they had done. And in 3 of these articles, they later issued corrections to update either their results or the data set that had been shared.
Not fully reproducible. Did that cover not at all reproducible, or what does not fully reproducible mean?
It means that we couldn't get the same numbers. And sometimes we could get numbers that were somewhat similar to the numbers they had reported. Indeed. So it doesn't mean that the whole finding is totally undercut. But it does mean that we couldn't find out what they were doing and how they got to the things they had reported. The reproducibility project Psychology came out in 2015. I had a small role in this. It was a systematic investigation of 100 studies in experimental psychology. In the original studies, here is the distribution of p-values. 97 out of 100 had a statistically significant finding supporting the author's hypothesis. This already suggests that something is there is some kind of bias, probably, because it's unlikely that we only investigate hypotheses of which we are already so certain and with such strong methods. In the replications, about 1/3 showed statistically significant p-values in the same direction, and the effect sizes were on average cut in half in the replications, suggesting the presence of bias in the published literature. The second crisis is one of affordability. Costs have gone up. The scientific publishers operate in what I believe economists call a monopolistic competition, which means that even though there are many different publishers and many different journals, you can't substitute one for another. If you want to read what is being published in a certain journal, it doesn't matter if you have a subscription to another one. So they can rack up the prices, and they have. And the cost of publications in Sweden now is somewhere on the order of about 800 million crowns per year, including subscription costs paid by the BIBSAM consortium, which is the collaboration that manages subscriptions for Swedish universities, as well as other subscriptions paid for directly by the universities and by other public sector organizations, as well as direct costs for open access publishing. 800 million crowns is quite a lot. It's comparable to the budget of one of the research councils like Forte or Formas. I don't have the exact numbers, but the order of magnitude is similar. There's a lot of research that we could be doing with this money instead of buying back the research that we have already published, performed and given for free to the publishers. Lastly, a crisis of functionality. When we look at scientific papers today, they still broadly look the same way they did when they were printed on paper. Even though the internet has been around for more than 3 decades, the scientific article is static. It's very difficult to update it if we find out something new. The format, the PDF, is difficult to do things with. One example here, going back to our study of clinical trials in the Nordic countries. We are now trying to follow up how many of them have shared any data. And we do this by text mining. So we download all the PDFs, and then we use a software that tries to crack the PDFs open so that we can transform them into text and then do text mining on them. And it's very cumbersome, and it doesn't always work. And it's it would be desirable that we could actually have a machine read the text in the publications that we put out. Quality control is generally performed by peer review, but this process is in most cases opaque. For a given scientific article, we have to trust the editors. If you were to take this article, for example, which I published many years ago, how would you know whether it has been peer reviewed, who the peers were, if they had any specific expertise, whether they liked the paper or not, whether they thought we should change anything, whether we actually did change anything, whether they recommended publication in the end or not. Of course, some journals now have open peer review where you can read the reviewers' reports, which is a step forward, but for the most part, the peer review is still opaque and unsystematic. It consists of asking experts to write a narrative summary and not necessarily to check, for example, whether the numbers add up or any other more tangible measures of quality, in my opinion. Authorship is the currency of merit. This implies that a researcher has to be an author, and if you're not an author, then you're not a researcher. It's difficult to work in a different role and still be a researcher. This inhibits specialization, and it makes it quite difficult also to see who has done what, who is responsible for what, who should be credited for what. Lastly, of course, as I've already talked about, access is limited. Many of the journal articles are behind paywalls. We could do better. This figure is an attempt of mine to illustrate what a system for research communication could look like if we invented it today. Here again, I'm not claiming that these ideas are particularly original, but because people have been talking about them for at least 20 years. We could envision a system of interoperable digital research objects. So instead of an article, we could envision, for example, data being published in a repository, code being published in a version control platform. We could envision that the code can operate on the data and that any third party could access the code, press a button, have the code call the data and generate the outputs that we could then check and verify. Also other digital research objects like a pre-registration, a data management plan, digital materials. Interpretations could live freely, as it were, not necessarily in the scope of an article, and could be open to updating. Lastly, we could also envision some kind of open community-based review and quality control of this diversity of research outputs. Even though this has been envisioned for a long time, very little change has actually happened. And I suspect the main reason is that the journal article still remains the main currency for credit for scientists, and I'll get back to that. The scientific publishers have not been slow to notice the digital transformation of science, and this figure is from our paper. Here we show that the larger publishers have been developing and or buying up services to cover different parts of the scientific workflow, from discovery through analysis, writing, publication, outreach, and over to assessment. And we have warned in our paper against the risks, especially the risks that research data become owned by large for-profit corporations and are not made available as a public good. Also the risk that assessment increasingly will rely on closed systems that we can't interrogate and that partly operate by tracking what researchers do when we interact with platforms to read articles, covert trackings of where we click, how long we spend reading different web pages and so on, which are then sold back both to universities for the purpose of assessment, but also to other parties for various reasons that we can't really know. This is, I believe, a risk to researchers' personal freedoms and integrity. We outlined some goals in the paper for a modern digital infrastructure. We suggest that infrastructures and ownership of research objects should be in the hands of the scientific community. We propose that journals should be replaced with a decentralized, resilient, evolvable network, interconnected by open standards. So to use repositories, and much of this already exists. Excellent repositories where we can put digital research objects. To replace the monopolies of journals with a functioning market where substitutable service providers can compete and innovate. So if we want a place to publish our outputs, we could approach that in the same way as if we want a system to provide pressurized air to our laboratory or a provider of antibodies. We could have perfectly ordinary tender processes and buy it in competition. This particular proposal has been interpreted in different ways, which has been fun to see. In social media, we have been called both libertarians as well as communists, which I really enjoyed. Lastly, to get there, we think it's necessary to replace the journal prestige as a proxy measure of quality with some actual assessment of quality in research. So as long as we still tie the assessment of researchers for hiring and promotion and grants to the names of the journals where work has been published, we will remain tied to the journals. I believe we can do much better and come up with ways to assess research that much better captures quality, and that could be a pathway away from the journals. Here's a figure from our paper. It's a bit involved, but it basically illustrates the open platforms that we suggest should be there, where we can put all kinds of digital research outputs. We think this should be managed by academic organizations, and the libraries probably have a key role here. And also that these infrastructures should be able to interact with various outputs that are aimed at policy and the general public more broadly, with easy interfaces for the academics to use. What could a pathway look like from here to there? We think it's necessary to redirect funding from the legacy publishers, basically to stop signing more subscription deals with the academic publishers. That would free up a lot of money that we could use for new infrastructures. We want to replace negotiated deals with standard tender processes. So instead of going into closed rooms with the publishers and have them say, we can let you have the papers for 100 million. The Royal Library, the Bibsam Consortium should put out an open call, and then the publishers can submit their tender if they want to operate platforms. One particular lever is with the funding agencies. In our paper, we suggest that they can require of universities to show that they provide their researchers with the necessary infrastructure to publish work as a condition for managing grants. I've already talked about stepping away from the reliance on prestige metrics This will require us to develop something else to put in its stead, which we don't quite have yet. And lastly, to ensure that any metrics used for monitoring and evaluation are themselves transparent and reproducible, such that a third party could look under the hood, see where the numbers come from, and how they have been arrived at. Here is one major policy development going on in the European Union. The Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment. It was launched last year. It has rather broad aims in reforming research assessment to promote open science, but also to promote certain other things. Diversity in outputs, multilingualism, knowledge valorization and contacts with the broader society. Once this started, it turned into a large shopping list of what the different people that joined wanted to put in. Now this coalition is going to work for another 5 years. A number of research organizations, including universities and funders, have signed up in Sweden and in Europe. And they have now undertaken to work systematically with reforming assessment in different ways, according to core principles, in which the strongest ones are to step away from the irresponsible use of metrics such as the impact factor, which is specifically being pointed at. However, it is not said what a responsible use of the impact factor might be. The option is left open that such a thing could exist. Also to step away from university rankings. But within this broad scope, these organizations that are members will work for the next 5 years and report back what they have done to facilitate mutual learning. There's a policy group of the Swedish Higher Education Institutions Association, SUHF, working on this as well. I am happy to be a member. It's very long, hard, and the outcome of the work is uncertain. But I'm trying to work from inside the system as well, not just stand on the sidelines and show that things ought to be better. Here is a model for behavior change in science that was proposed by Brian Nosek, who was the leading figure behind the reproducibility project Psychology that I showed before. He also leads the Center for Open Science in Virginia. He believes that we need to work on these 5 levels. We need first to make it possible for researchers to practice science openly by having infrastructures. This, I believe, is a problem that is largely solved, although work remains to be done. But for most kinds of research outputs, there are infrastructures where we can today put them and have them made openly available to the community. We need better user interfaces to make it easy. We need our communities to work together and make it normative to practice open science. We need incentives to make it rewarding, and we need policy to make it required. And here, again, when it comes to policy, I think there has been a lot of movement in the last years. The Swedish government has mandated the entire higher education sector in Sweden to move to a fully open research system by 2026, meaning that all our outputs should be published open access, and all research data should be made openly available under the principle as open as possible, as closed as necessary. Similar policy initiatives have come from the European Commission and from some large international funders like the Wellcome Trust and the Gates Foundation. Where we are lagging behind, in my opinion, is here in the middle when it comes to making it normative and rewarding to practice open science. I have some suggestions for the discussion, how to move forward. The badges for open science practices were an initiative started by the Center for Open Science. And I was chair of the committee that defined the criteria for these badges. So these are things that you can ask for. About 100 journals have implemented these badges. So if you submit a paper there and it's accepted, you can tick a box and say, I had pre-registered my studies, so I want this badge to be put on it. Or I had shared the data, or I had shared the materials. In most cases, this is the model that is used. The authors themselves disclose whether they have met the criteria, and then they get the badge. It's in most cases not well verified whether the authors have actually earned it or not. That's a criticism that is often levied against the badges. But this was by design, and anyone who issues the badges can choose for themselves how much control they want to apply, how much verification they want to build in. The Open Data Badge was at first heralded as a success story. It was introduced in the journal Psychological Science, and here is an observational study showing that data sharing increased sharply from just a few percentage points to about 40% after the Open Data Badge was introduced. But of course, other things happened at the same time. Without randomization, you can't be sure. There was later a randomized study in a different journal that tested this badge and showed that it had no effect on data sharing under those circumstances. This, in my view, is a great success story because it shows how we can take a policy intervention and actually test it. There are very few, if any, other policy interventions to improve open science practices that have been properly tested in a randomized experiment. And this, I believe, is a kind of blueprint for how we could move on with experimentation on other policy interventions. Now, finally, here is the success story, the ending to, perhaps, to the story of our paper on replacing academic journals. We were asked to write it to facilitate the policy work at the European level, and this culminated in new Council conclusions which came out earlier this year during the Swedish presidency of the European Union. Council conclusions that were titled High Quality, Transparent, Open, Trustworthy and Equitable Scholarly Publishing. There's a quote here from Mats Persson, the Minister for Higher Education. If we really believe in open science, we need to make sure that researchers can make their findings available and reusable, and that high-quality scientific articles are openly accessible to anyone that needs to read them. This should be particularly the case for research that benefits from public funding. What has been paid by all should be accessible to all. A strong statement from the Minister. However, what he says here is not really what is new in these conclusions. That has been said before by the Council of Ministers back in 2016, I believe. What is new in these conclusions, and they're quite long, but I have put in one clause here which I think is maybe the most important one. That these Council conclusions say that we should move into a not-for-profit, open-access, multi-format scholarly publishing model, or models, with no direct costs for authors nor for readers. What these Council conclusions envision is that we move away from the scientific journals over to a system of open infrastructures, open platforms. One example of such a platform could be Open Research Europe, the journal that is now operated by the European Commission, which you may have seen, which has no charges for authors and is a fully open access journal and is open for anyone who has a grant from one of the framework programs. So that is the conclusion of my presentation, and I hope that we can now discuss broadly about all these things. Where can we go? What should we do? What does this mean for us as researchers? So thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for this concise talk. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions. Let me start out with one question. I mean, basically, if you want to change anything from the global world order to publishing, you have to speak about where to go, which I think you did very well, but also how to get there. And you did say a little bit about that, but I thought that was a little bit less developed in your talk. So, I mean, basically, how is this going to be done? I mean, you said this last thing, but are there other proposals, for example, if you take our cue from political philosophy, you could have some ideas about, nationalizing these big publishers or buying them up and then making them to non-for-profit. I mean, do you do calculations how much that would cost? That's from a political philosopher. That's how you would think. How do you do this? And easy thing would to kind of get these companies and just buy them up and reform them. Is there any discussion like that?
Not so much, and maybe the reason why is that we don't need them. I mean, of course, we could buy them up if we're talking about philosophical ideas, but what's the point? I believe
Point
we
is here. I'm going to give you a point. Yeah, I'm a young philosopher or a young whatever. They can get their paper published in one of these very big prestigious journals. It's not open access, or they can publish in an open access journal. You know what they're going to do. That's what's best for their career. But if we have, if you made bought up these journals and made them open access and everything like that, then there would be no problem. Everything's solved. I mean, I'm just saying it in a simplistic way, but that would be typically, if you want to do a reform, you take what is there and reform it rather than building up something parallel and new, because it's slower.
Yes, so let's think about what that would look like. If we have the large publishers, so I believe that many of the problems I have described with the way the publishers operate, the way that they cause a selection of papers for novelty rather than quality, this is inextricably tied with the prestige model. So if we retain the prestige model, but we have it operated by the state, then we solve perhaps the problem of increasing costs. These companies have huge profit margins, which is, I mean, it suggests that there's a scope for savings for the state if we were to nationalize them. But much greater savings could be achieved by simply not giving away our papers for free and then buying them back. And maybe less radical, but in my opinion, very useful policy direction comes from countries that have emphasized the rights of authors to retain their own copyright. So, for instance, in the Netherlands, they have legislated that authors are allowed to publish their works in repositories, whether or not they have first been published in a scientific journal. So I could then publish my paper in a high prestige journal and still parallel publish the final version in an open repository. This, I believe, strongly undercuts the model of the journals and their ability to rack up prices. But it also depends on building out support. For example, in order for that to gain coverage, we would need our university libraries probably to seek out researchers and say, I see you've published another paper. Congratulations. Now we're going to put it on this repository for you if you don't mind. Support functions like that would probably be necessary to get good coverage.
So the basic idea is I would like to see, or you wonder if somebody done, like some different pathways, calculating the cost, calculating the feasibility. Sound like a boring political scientist here. Economist, something like that, but maybe that's on its way.
We haven't really done any exercises like that. I don't know if anyone has. I think it would be very difficult to estimate any reliable numbers.
But don't do a cost-benefit analysis, it's hard to make change. But anyway, I should leave the floor open. There's going to be more questions there. So the floor is open. So please, if you haven't already put up your hand. And I see a first hand, and that is Pontus, and he's going to need a microphone. So I give that to Christer so he can pass it on.
Thank you. I really like this talk. And first of all, I just want to say, apart from all of the problems you talked about, the massive amount of time it takes from that we know what our results are until we actually get published, the massive amount of work is another part of functionality which fails researcher. So whatever new system we have should also address that. I was interested in this making it normative. So it seems to me that the quickest way to make it normative is to change the rules for giving out funding. So the funding agencies now say you have to do open access. But whenever I apply to them, they say, give me your publication record. And they give me no indication that they're not going to look at the prestige of the journals in which I've published. So they're kind of on the one side, but on the other side, there's still, is there any talk about changing the funding system so that they will no longer evaluate what journals are published in?
I agree with you that that is the main lever at our disposal to make a change. The scientific funders have a huge normative role in deciding what kinds of outputs we should value and how. And I also totally agree with you. When I apply for money from the Swedish Research Council or other large Swedish funders, they usually ask for a publication list. They want to know the names of the journals, but they don't ask how many data sets I have published or how many people have reused the data sets and come up with interesting new things, and so on. There are other funders that are making some headway. If you apply for, let's say, a Marie Curie postdoc, or other grants from the Horizon program, you will typically be expected to write a section on open science practices and show that you will increase the value of the work by putting out the results openly, and there you can point to your track record. So when I talk to younger scientists, I try to argue usually that it's in their interest to develop a track record for open science practices, and that it may well be hoped that many publishers will follow on and incorporate it into their evaluations. There are other examples. The very large German funder, the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, have moved from publication lists to lists of outputs where you can list different kinds of scientific objects that you have contributed. There's also a drive towards the narrative CV, which is a much more qualitative approach. I'm not fully convinced that that's the solution, because it gets very arbitrary. But it's something that's being increasingly trialed, and it may be hoped that we have some better, some more systematic, let's say, gatherings of experiences from people who have tried these kinds of methods. But overall, I'd like to reiterate that we need to build something new, in my opinion, some systematic way to assess quality that starts with the basics. If I have contributed some research, what evidence is there that the data exists in the first place? Do the data have the right number of observations? Are the observations compatible with the laws of nature? I mean, once you start looking into these things, if you take a small set of papers and look at these very basic questions, you find discrepancies very quickly. You find data sets that don't exist. You find impossible values. And it's nobody's job to check in the system that we have today. We are like a car factory that allows independent artisans to build their own contraptions and then send them out with the university brand without anyone checking if there are brakes or lights on them before they roll out the door.
Just to clarify, all of these attempts that are starting to bubble are about adding criteria. None of them is actually looking at starting to ignore the massive criteria that is having a publication in a nice journal. So I can do open data and all of that, but I can still publish in Nature, and that would be the best for me, or for this young philosopher. And no one is even looking at how to change that.
Well, it is very widely acknowledged as a problem. But I can't point out exactly who has been practicing what they preach and who has stopped looking at impact factors and prestige journal names.
Okay, yeah, thank you for a very interesting.
Okay. So thank you for a very interesting talk. I think I agree with everything that you've said today. But I have a question. I would like to know a little bit more about how you think about peer review in this new proposed system, because I guess I have one. I wouldn't say that it would be worse, but I have one worry that I could sort of imagine with a different system. In the attempts that I've seen on having this more rapidly published, more open science publication system, you have these journals where it's open access, and then you see the reviews, and then people can comment on these articles. And I guess in my field, sociology, maybe it wouldn't be so harmful, but I could see that in, for instance, medical science, if you have sort of more preliminary results openly published, and then maybe 2 years later there is a review by somebody, and then you realize, okay, maybe it wasn't such a great study. But when you have the public reading these results, that could lead to false hopes. Imagine, for instance, that there is a study on a new cancer treatment method or something. It could lead to false hopes, and sometimes to false fear. And it can even fuel conspiracy theories if sort of unrobust results are openly published, and then, it's up to the academic community to sort of review that and evaluate it as, over time, so to speak. And it puts a heavier burden on the public to actually be able to evaluate research, and they are not. I think that there has to be this sort of badge of quality already at the moment of publication. Otherwise, it could lead to more harm, maybe, than good. Have you thought about this?
Indeed, I think there are such examples of preprints that come out with health-related advice that turns out to be completely wrong and it causes people to act in ways that are harmful. It's a genuine concern. On the other hand, this happens in the traditional journals too. There are many examples of extremely harmful results that have come out with a kind of stamp of approval, and that have fueled, for example, vaccine skepticism or other dangerous things. We can reasonably disagree, perhaps, on whether it's better to have a stamp of approval, although it doesn't always work, or whether it's better to not have a stamp of approval because it doesn't always work. I would favor the more radical solution of letting researchers stand by their own work. For example, I often get comments from reviewers that I don't like. I suppose every researcher has their own catalogue of horror stories of peer review. But the point I want to get to specifically now is that usually I follow their advice anyway. Now, it could be that I am sometimes wrong and that my papers are improved by following the reviewers' recommendations. But it diffuses the responsibility. It makes me write things that I can't really stand for. Now, is this my work anymore? Where is the stamp of quality? Should people believe it because they believe in my professionalism and the processes that I have implemented, such as maybe I have a second person reviewing the analytical code? Or should they believe it because it has the journal's stamp of approval? I think any stamp of approval needs to be based on some kind of open process that can be interrogated. So, well, put it like this. You have a strong argument that we need to have something, and it's better to have something than to have nothing. I argue that we need something that is much better, but it doesn't quite exist yet, and I'm aware that that's a weakness in my arguments.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so then Lars, please, you're going to get a microphone.
Thank you for the presentation. I think all of us agree that we have a problem here in terms of the publishing industry and the academics. And there are lots of efforts to break this. You mentioned Quora, and there is also this DORA, which came in the US many years ago. But so far we haven't seen much impact. And I think the reason is that how we behave, the profession ourselves. We are guilty. And in terms of resource allocation, I happen to work with some funding organizations, and we say, you should look at the proposal, not at what people have done before. But at the end of the day, I see that, that guy has published in that journal, and so forth. And also we see it at many of our academic institutions that there are just some kind of papers that are published in certain journals that are counted. So I think it's so crucial that we are breaking this focus on what kind of journals people are publishing. You say impact factors, extremely important. And as you mentioned, of course, if you have the opportunity to publish in a journal with a high impact factor, you try it. And just a parenthesis, most people look at those high impact factors, and most of them are rejected, which means that the papers are moving down the system. So we're getting a homogeneity in the system. So my main concern here is how can we change ourselves here? And I think at the bottom here there is a mistake that professional organizations did long time ago, because most of the journals, they were founded by professional organizations. And then after some time they found that, these publishers, they had the machinery. And so they're left over. So maybe we should come back with the professional organizations to take more control over this. But I think it's fundamental that we need a change. So it's not just rhetoric, but also practice. So how do you solve that?
Yes, these are very good points, and I am guilty too, indeed. Sometimes people talk about a research culture that needs to change. And that may be the case, but I believe it's more helpful to think of it as a set of mechanisms. Because when we think of it that way, each of the mechanisms has someone that is responsible for it. The funders are responsible for their decisions. The universities are responsible for their decisions. We, all of us, when we are reviewers of research in different contexts, for journals and for grants, we are responsible for our decisions. So each of us can consider what we think is necessary to make science better and act accordingly. That perspective is a bit more it suggests that change is possible more easily, I believe, than the culture change perspective. But indeed, there are many interlocking components, and a strong lock-in where many different actors need to move, but nobody has an advantage in moving first. Still, with the change that is happening, it used to be the case, for example, when I talked to the Swedish Research Council, and I suggested that they should lead the way on open science practices. They used to say, we can't go before the rest of the world. But now it's more a case of not going after the rest of the world, because others are moving. Still, they're not, very much, but it's a very big question, but I think I'll leave my answer there. Otherwise, I'll yes, I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, but I think the important thing here, you talk about universities, you're talking of funding bodies, how they make their decisions. But at the end of the day, those are populated by people like us.
Indeed.
Universities are populated by researchers, and research councils are populated by researchers who are doing their evaluations and so forth.
Indeed.
Yeah.
We
So
have done this to ourselves, I do believe.
Yeah.
And,
So I had a colleague who published something in the 70s where they talked about the social deadlock, that everybody feels that we have a problem and nobody can really change it.
yes, indeed. So since I have the opportunity to say something about political philosophy, I believe that some people have argued that the problem is that we have too much neoliberalism and new public management, and research is being evaluated by the number of papers that we publish and so on. I don't believe that. I don't believe that it's something that someone else has done to the research system. The problem is not that the government has suddenly asked us to publish in high impact factors or anything like that. It's entirely due to the normative structure within science. Well, I'm trying to work both to make a policy change and to construct better alternatives. Perhaps I can come back in 5 or 10 years and demonstrate better ways to assess science. We can see.
For that, there's a follow-up, I think, from Stefan.
No, it's just
Okay. I got so carried away by Gustav's talks, I forgot to instruct people that the system here is you put your hand if you have a new question and a finger if you have a finger. That's my fault. I was too carried away. And for you online, you use right hand or finger if you have a new. But then, I'm sorry, it won't be you yet because we have some other people on the list, namely people online. And so it will be Amal. If you please could come, put on your video and your sound.
Thank you for these points, and I appreciate that you bring in the global perspective in particular, and the challenges of researchers in countries with less resources for research funding. It is true that in my talk I focused on quantitative science because that's where my own background is. I'm not exactly sure how this extends to qualitative science, simply because I have so limited experience with it myself. But I'm thinking that there are some generalities in terms of reproducibility, making results available, checking other things. There was one one thing that I don't exactly know much about, but which I found very interesting the other week, was a paper by a historian on reproducible science in history. He suggested that references in historical research are very poorly verified, and that if you actually go through and check the references that are made in historical research, many of them don't support the claims that are being made. And I think that could be one example of how this generalizes to to the humanities in that case. Although I've never done any research myself in history, of course, so others know that much better. I think you had another question which I have now lost. Yes, thank you. Yes, and this ties in a bit with the discussion we had about preprints and quality control. Misinformation can be based on research published in the traditional journals, of course, or on preprints or research published in other platforms. During the pandemic, I thought we saw some excellent examples of people battling misinformation. I have some friends and colleagues who are very active in doing open peer review. For instance, when the first study came out of on hydroxychloroquine, that immediately led to a very widespread use of this medication against COVID in hospitalized patients. This study was published, incidentally, in a journal where the editor-in-chief was working in the same department where the lead researcher on the study was the department head. But of course, that's not anything that you would know unless it had been widely discussed later on social media. It was accepted after a very short time. I don't remember exactly, but it was something on the order of about 2 days. So you can ask yourself what kind of peer review is possible in that time. Maybe it was excellent peer review, maybe it was not, who knows. But it was very rapidly dug into by people who actually fact-check research. And these are mostly volunteers working for free. One of the lead people doing it is a friend of mine. He's a retired psychologist who lives on the Canary Islands, and in his spare time he likes to check scientific literature to look for various inconsistencies. And they found a lot of inconsistencies, and this whole thing has later been debunked. Very many patients were treated in the meantime to no effect. So perhaps to combat misinformation, we need some kind of trusted third party that can actually vet scientific results, regardless of where they are published. I think actually that having such a function would be not merely excellent for knowledge production as such, but also invaluable as a part of our pandemic preparedness. But here again, I'm talking broadly about things that don't really exist yet, but that I wish we could have. So maybe it's not a solution that we can have today or tomorrow, but maybe down the line. Yes. Well, I don't worry so much about AIs writing more papers. That's probably already happening, but and it might, I suppose, shift the balance of merit if you keep counting the numbers of publications. But I don't think it's very much going to undermine our foundation of knowledge unless you use the AI to fabricate data or something such. I'm a bit optimistic that we can use various AI tools to to crack open older scientific literature, to have AIs extract the actual information from research that is today hard to interact with, and do things like read large amounts of text for us, take out the data and put it in a structured format. I'm cautiously optimistic.
I think on that point, unfortunately, time has been running out, so we can't continue asking. I still have lots of questions here, but so join me in thanking you for this very important discussion, and I'm sure ongoing discussions. Thank you very much. We have some seminars coming up. We have Vegard Skikbæk, who's going to talk about understanding the global transition to low fertility on October 25th. And then on November 8th, we have Are Stereotypers Wrong When Stereotyped by Kasper Lippert Rasmussen. And on November 15th, we have a joint seminar with Rutgers, but I don't know yet the title, but you're all welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much.